Hi, welcome to the the third lecture about feeding and eating disorders. Today we're going to be talking about anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. That's hard to see, but also known as the weight and shape family of eating disorders, because all three of these eating disorders involve maladaptive eating behaviors that are directly related to concerns and maladaptive thoughts about body weight and body shape. This lecture is going to be another kind of long one because, again, there's no reading in the textbook for this lecture. So I'm hoping to provide some background and then also some new information about these disorders. Okay, before we get started, there's some terminology specific to eating disorders, specific to the diagnosis of eating disorders, including body mass index, or BMI. So BMI is essentially a measure of how much mass per square meters of height someone has. It is commonly used as a measure of what's known as adiposity, or how much body fat someone has, but it's actually not a perfect metric of that because mass doesn't specify whether that mass is from muscle or fat. But it's a really commonly used metric of someone's weight status because it's kind of a snapshot of how much someone weighs relative to what you would expect and what is healthy for their age and gender. So an underweight BMI is a BMI less than 18.5, which again is a ratio of how much someone weighs to how tall they are. A so-called healthy BMI is anything between 18.5 and like 25, 24.9. The overweight BMI range is anything above 25 and anything below 30. And the obese BMI range is anything above 30. So it's important to note that body mass index is not a measure of health. It is one variable that can give you a snapshot about your health or someone else's, but it doesn't equal health. There's also not a ton of evidence that there's any real medical risks to being overweight, to being in the BMI range between 25 and 30. Probably the biggest medical risk associated with overweight is that it often leads to obesity, which is related to health problems like heart disease and diabetes. But even then, it's important to note that not everyone with an obese BMI is unhealthy. Obesity is a risk factor for chronic diseases, but it is not in and of itself a disease. And again, overweight, depending on a person's age, is not really correlated with a lot of negative physical health outcomes other than continuing to gain weight and having an obese BMI. In fact, in elderly people, there's some evidence that being overweight is actually protective relative to being a quote unquote healthy weight. Okay, so when we talk about eating disorders, we're talking about three important constellations of problematic eating behaviors. So the first problematic eating behavior is restrictive eating, which is intentionally reducing one's caloric intake, or the amount of food someone's taking in, and maintaining a low intake over time. Compensating is a constellation of behaviors that people can engage in order to compensate for food eaten. So rather than restricting the amount of calories going in, compensatory behaviors are about burning off calories or expelling calories through purging, which can be accomplished with vomiting or laxative abuse. Compensating for eating the prior day by fasting, which is defined as skipping 2 or more meals in a row. And exercise with the specific purpose of getting rid of calories. Compensating, someone can compensate for any kind of eating. Someone can compensate for apparently normal eating, for binge eating, or even for restrictive eating. So compensating isn't directly tied to any specific kind of eating. It's just a behavior that's designed to get rid of calories that have been consumed. The last problematic eating behavior is binge eating, which is defined as eating an objectively large amount of food in a discrete and relatively short period of time. That time frame is usually about 2 hours. And during that time frame, with an objectively large amount of food consumed, a person also has to experience a subjective loss of control. So either feeling like they can't stop eating, can't control how much they're eating, or feeling like they're not even fully aware of how much they're eating. So binging, restricting, and compensating are the three problematic eating behaviors that come up in all weight and shape related eating disorders, and also that don't come up in ARFID. the cognitive features of restrictive eating disorders include preoccupation with weight and shape. So having a personal ideal body type in mind and thinking a lot about that body type, comparing yourself a lot to that body type, being really driven to get to that body type and being really dysphoric and upset that you're not at that body type. Cognitive features of disordered eating can include a drive for thinness, which is an extremely strong goal to be thinner than you are, a powerful desire to be thin and to lose weight. Eating disorders are also defined by a fear of gaining weight, or in some cases, a fear of food. People who restrict will often talk about fear foods or foods that they intentionally avoid eating usually because they're thought to contain too many calories or be too calorically dense. People with eating disorders are often really, really preoccupied with food, and we'll talk about why later in this lecture, but because restrictive eating, compensating for eating, and binge eating are the behavioral features that define eating disorders, cognitively, people with eating disorders spend a lot of time thinking about eating and thinking about food. And then many people with eating disorders experience shame, guilt, and depression, other negative affect after eating. So feeling regretful about eating. The main distinction, the main cognitive feature that is diagnostic of anorexia nervosa, someone with anorexia nervosa has to have these features to be diagnosed, are preoccupation with weight and body shape and fear of gaining weight. But these cognitive features are seen in anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. So these are the 3 eating disorder diagnoses that the DSM-5 recognizes in addition to ARFID, pica, and rumination. So anorexia nervosa is characterized by extreme preoccupation with weight and shape and behaviors that prevent weight gain. So this can be compensating and restricting. In addition, to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, someone has to have significantly low weight. So they have to be underweight, have a body weight or a BMI below 18.5. Bulimia nervosa is defined by binge eating at least 1 time a week, followed by compensatory behaviors. The most common type of compensatory behaviors in bulimia are purging, but again, it can also include excessive exercise or compensatory fasting. In contrast to anorexia nervosa, to be diagnosed with bulimia nervosa, a patient cannot be underweight. They can be healthy weight through obese BMI, but they can't be underweight. A diagnosis of binge eating disorder involves binging once a week, just like bulimia, but without any compensatory behaviors linked to binges. That doesn't mean that people with binge eating disorder don't engage in compensatory behaviors and don't diet, but what it does mean is that people don't compensate directly for their binges. They don't purge after binging, essentially. And then there's no weight requirement involved in binge eating disorder, but there is a requirement that a person experience significant impairment or distress caused by their binging. And notice that impairment and distress aren't diagnostic criteria for anorexia and bulimia nervosa. These disorders have what we might consider slightly more objective diagnostic criteria, in that for anorexia, you have to be underweight and engaging in certain behaviors to prevent weight gain. And for bulimia nervosa, you cannot be underweight and have to be engaging in binging and compensatory, usually purging behaviors. There are 2 subtypes of anorexia nervosa. Restricting anorexia is defined by caloric restriction and compensation only, whereas binge purge anorexia involves binging and purging behavior similar to what you would see in bulimia nervosa, but with underweight. So really the main difference between binge purge anorexia and bulimia nervosa is whether or not someone is underweight. So another way of thinking about defining the 3 eating disorders by their behavioral features is, there shouldn't be a comma there, but the disorder that involves both binging and compensating is bulimia nervosa. The disorder that involves only binging is binge eating disorder. Anorexia nervosa and binge eating disorder can both involve binging and restricting without compensation. Anorexia can involve both restricting and compensating. And anorexia and bulimia nervosa can involve all 3, binging, restricting, and compensating. So thinking about the diagnostic criteria for the weight and shape family of eating disorders, compared to other disorders we've talked about, like I said, the diagnoses are more specific and less heterogeneous than other DSM-5 disorders. For the eating disorders, there's no long list of criteria where you have to have a certain number to meet the diagnostic threshold, like with depression, having 5 out of 9 depression symptoms. You have to have every symptom, and you have to have very specific behaviors and very specific weight outcomes for the diagnosis of anorexia and bulimia. There are more similarities than differences between the three restricting, or among the three restricting eating disorders. So the main distinction between anorexia and bulimia nervosa is weight loss. A person can engage in once weekly binging with compensation afterwards. If they're underweight, they would be diagnosed with anorexia, and if they are normal weight or overweight, they'd be diagnosed with bulimia. The main difference between bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder is whether there's compensation directly after a binge, or whether specific episodes of binge eating are tied to specific compensatory behaviors. So I'm going to show a little bit of a guest lecture. You guys don't have to watch the full guest lecture video for this one. The only required part of this guest lecture is what I'm about to show. But this is a conversation with my friend, Professor Jamal Asaeli, who is the director of the Young Adult Eating Disorders program at Penn State Hershey in Pennsylvania. So he's going to be talking about the differences and similarities between bulimia and anorexia nervosa, and how we make that diagnostic distinction in practice, and how much it really matters to make that distinction for clinical work and research.
Given the symptom overlap, is there anything important about differentiating these two disorders from one another? I think there are. So something that's interesting when we look at treatment outcomes for anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, we do find that, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the leading outpatient treatment for adults with eating disorders, we find that CBT is more effective in individuals with bulimia nervosa than it is for individuals with anorexia nervosa. Also, individuals with anorexia nervosa tend to be characterized by, are more commonly characterized by certain personality traits like perfectionism, high achieving personality traits, and it's a little bit, the literature I believe on bulimia nervosa and personality is a little bit less consistent, but like impulsivity is a feature that's considered to be higher in individuals with bulimia, but actually lower in individuals with anorexia nervosa. So there are like trends for these different personality traits. And again, there is something about treatment, the treatment outcomes are a little bit different, where individuals with anorexia nervosa are like historically one of the most difficult individuals to treat, or one of the most difficult disorders to treat. So I do actually think there is something to be said about the success of effortful dietary restraint and successful weight loss and or maintaining low body weight. That can feel really reinforcing or really good. Individuals with bulimia nervosa are often trying to lose weight, and some have successfully lost some weight as a result of dietary restraint, but many of them come to treatment having struggled a lot with weight loss and have ended up engaging in these binge eating, purging behaviors. And most of them feel at least somewhat ambivalent or don't love the fact that they're engaging in binge eating and purging. And so I think they're already kind of a little bit more motivated to enter treatment that's going to make them feel better, and they already sort of don't love these eating disorder symptoms. Individuals with anorexia nervosa have successfully accomplished the thing they sought out to accomplish. They sought out to accomplish weight loss, and they've accomplished weight loss. And I think part of what keeps that going is this positive reinforcement cycle of feeling that you set your goal, your mind to something to set a goal, and you feel pride because of it. You feel a sense of achievement and accomplishment, and it can help sort of facilitate more control in one's life. At least a lot of individuals with anorexia will say that. So I think there is a more stronger positive reinforcement component to successful weight loss. And I also think there's personality traits that allow a small subset of humans to be more successful at doing the really hard thing of starving yourself, basically. And so I think because of that, that is one reason at least to why treatment is more challenging with that population. And so I think it's more this feature of like, how does a small subset of people end up successfully starving themselves all the time, despite their body fighting against it? And I think there is something there about that feature and personality traits and mechanisms that are involved with anorexia nervosa that do make that disorder a little bit unique from bulimia nervosa in some ways. So I think my answer to that question is, I think that there's this transdiagnostic theory which says there's so much symptom overlap. Often patients will cross over from one disorder to the next. We don't need to like be categorizing them into these different groups. And I see that given how, as I just said, it's so complicated that these symptoms occur across diagnoses. On the other hand, I think if we didn't have these separate diagnoses, we might lose the fact that actually this group's a lot harder to treat, and there might be some things going on in this group that do make them unique in some way.
Yeah, so there's something like special about being underweight that really does make anorexia different.
I mean, there's the effects of malnutrition in and of itself. So when you're starving, it's harder to, for example, engage in rational decision-making or engage in maybe more abstract psychological treatment. But also the psychologically what it takes to end up starving yourself like that, like the convincing of yourself and the successful persistence of starvation, that feature I think is maybe the most important piece from a psychological perspective of what differentiates the subset of individuals with eating disorders who are at low weight status.
Okay, so is that hurting? Takeaways from that. There are a lot of similarities, arguably more similarities than differences between anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And diagnostically speaking, really the only difference is whether or not someone has experienced extreme weight loss because of their restrictive eating. So a question that we ask a lot in eating disorder research is what's actually different about people with eating disorders who lose a lot of weight and maintain that extreme weight loss? So in the video, we mentioned the physiological effects of being underweight, which we won't touch on too much in this lecture, but they are important. When an organism is starving, it changes their thought processes and it changes their cognitive capabilities. Being starved makes humans and animals extremely focused and single-minded, and that can make it difficult to engage in abstract rational thinking. It can also make it really difficult to shift someone's goal, shift someone's mindset away from what they're trying to accomplish. So ironically, the more starved someone is, the more persistent and goal-oriented they are towards continuing to starve themselves if that's their goal. And that is a physiological effect of just being underweight and starving. But a more interesting risk factor, because it precedes the disordered eating behavior and it precedes the weight loss, is the temperament of people who are able to achieve and maintain this really extreme weight loss. So some of the traits that Dr. Asali mentioned are being really perfectionistic. So we talked about this with OCD and OCPD, but just not being able to tolerate imperfection, uncertainty, not being able to deal with like coming close but not fully achieving one's goal. People with this temperament tend to be really successful in a lot of areas of life. They're very driven, very goal-oriented. They're really good at setting aside pleasure and gratification in pursuit of a single-minded goal. That goal doesn't just have to be weight loss. And there are people like this who don't have the goal of weight loss. So later in the video, Dr. Asali talks about research done with people who are extremely successful in their professions. And this can include competitive bird watchers. It can include mountain climbers. It can include distance runners. It can include chess players. But these are all people who are perfectionistic, who are driven, who are goal-oriented, and who are willing to set aside most of their lives and other goals in favor of a single goal. When that goal is weight loss, having that temperament makes it possible to lose weight so successfully that you starve yourself and meet criteria for anorexia nervosa. So that temperament, that what we'll call the anorexic temperament, is going to be really important for the rest of this lecture. And it's really the main distinction between someone with an eating disorder who will develop bulimia and someone with an eating disorder who will develop anorexia nervosa. Okay, so just a little bit of boring stuff about prevalence. This prevalence data is the most up-to-date data that we have. So it's more up-to-date than the data in your textbook, not that your textbook is required. But this data was collected, I believe, in 2017, or at least the data collection ended in 2017. So this is nationally representative population-based data from the United States. The lifetime prevalence of anorexia nervosa in the United States is less than 1%, but it's actually a little bit, it's 1.5% of women and a very small percentage of men. Anorexia nervosa is very highly comorbid with anxiety, depression, OCD, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Again, because of that perfectionistic, single-minded, goal-oriented, pleasure-denying temperament that sort of helps someone become anorexic. In the United States, having a higher income is actually associated with higher lifetime risk of anorexia nervosa. So remember that statistic when later we talk about the relationship between social class and eating disorders. The lifetime prevalence of bulimia nervosa in the United States is, that might not be right. I'll have to double check that figure because clinically it's actually more common. The diagnosis of bulimia nervosa is more common in clinical settings than the diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. But again, as Dr. Asali just discussed, patients with bulimia nervosa tend to be more distressed by their symptoms. Their symptoms are less egosyntonic. They're less consistent with the person's goals and values, so they are more likely to seek treatment. So the important takeaway, though, is that just like anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, according to the diagnostic criteria we have right now, is more common in women than men. Bulimia, there's a lot of diagnostic crossover between bulimia and anorexia because the only difference is successful weight loss, but many people develop bulimia after having anorexia and regaining weight, or after having binge eating disorder and beginning to compensate for binges. Compared to anorexia, in terms of comorbidity, bulimia nervosa is more linked to borderline personality disorder traits than to OCPD traits. It's also more likely to be comorbid with substance use disorders and other psychopathology that involves impulse control problems. So things like compulsive gambling, compulsive shopping. Bulimia nervosa, just like anorexia nervosa, is also really highly comorbid with depression and anxiety. And again, just like anorexia and bulimia, binge eating disorder is more common in women than men, but the gender ratio is a little bit more even. So men are more likely to have binge eating disorder than the other two eating disorders. Compared to anorexia and bulimia, which tend to have adolescent and, well, early to late adolescent ages of onset, the modal age of onset for bulimia nervosa is mid-20s. That's a little bit different than the chart that I've showed in the previous two lectures that show the age of onset of binge eating being early teens. That's because that's the age of onset of the behavior. So binge eating behavior tends to start relatively young, and it often starts earlier than successful weight loss efforts and earlier than purging behavior. But binge eating disorder itself, so the frequency, chronicity, and impairment that comes from the binges tends to have a later age of onset. So whereas anorexia nervosa is obviously linked to being underweight, in the population, binge eating disorder is linked to overweight and obesity. So people with binge eating disorder are more likely to have higher BMIs. There's actually no relationship between bulimia nervosa and body weight in representative samples. People with bulimia nervosa are anywhere on the weight spectrum from healthy weight to obese. So from the previous slide, you might get the sense that eating disorders are pretty rare, but that is very far from the truth. Because the criteria for eating disorders are pretty tight and objective, it can actually still be hard to meet criteria for these disorders. We talked about EDNOS in the last lecture. The current diagnostic criteria for eating disorders are an improvement on the old diagnostic criteria. So for example, to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, in the past, if you were a woman, you had to have lost your period. You had to be so severely malnourished that you were no longer menstruating. That's not a requirement anymore. So that makes more women able to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa in the earlier stages of the disease, or women who just, for whatever reason, don't lose their periods as easily when they're starving. But still, the diagnostic criteria for eating disorders are pretty tight. So there's a lot of people out there who have subclinical levels of disordered eating behaviors and cognitions with a lot of distress and impairment from those behaviors, but who don't technically meet criteria for an eating disorder diagnosis. And this starts really young. So by age 9 to 10, 35 to 40% of elementary school age girls say that they wish that they were thinner than they are. And as many as 20% say that they spend a lot of time thinking about wanting to be thinner, engage in subclinical disordered eating behaviors like paying attention to calories, counting calories, or thinking about burning calories when they exercise. And as many as 2% say that they've engaged in purging behavior, so vomiting after eating. By early adolescence, so by age 14, about 20% of girls and about 5% of boys report extreme body dissatisfaction. So a level of body dissatisfaction that's seen in anorexia nervosa, the same level of body dissatisfaction that's seen in patients with anorexia nervosa, but not meeting criteria for anorexia nervosa because there's no extreme restrictive eating or extreme weight loss. But extreme body dissatisfaction, extreme distress, and extreme drive and desire to lose weight. By college, as many as 50% of college women and 30% of college men have engaged in binge eating, and as many as 30% of both men and women say that they've compensated for eating, whether that's binge eating or normal non-restrictive eating in some way. And then by adulthood, so after college, again, about 50% of adults score in the elevated range on measures of problematic eating behaviors that can include things like extreme unhealthy dieting, a lot of weight and shape concerns, compensation for eating, and binge eating. So although eating disorders themselves are relatively rare in the population, disordered eating thoughts and behaviors are really common and they're really impairing. So as many as 75% of people with weight and shape concerns or with a desire to lose weight and be thinner say that these thoughts and feelings and the behaviors associated with dieting interfere with their happiness. So that is a lot of distress and suffering coming from subclinical disordered eating behaviors in the United States. So we've talked so far about anorexia nervosa with its two subtypes, restrictive anorexia and binge purge anorexia. We've talked about binge eating disorder, and we've talked about bulimia nervosa. I'm just going to read you a little case study about a hypothetical patient with disordered eating. So Jamie started dieting in middle school, which at the time meant counting calories and trying to work out several times a week. In high school, Jamie's dieting escalated to extreme exercise that was intended to burn calories and extreme dieting behaviors like fasting for 24 hours and cutting out whole food groups from their diet. So things like sugar, including fruits and simple carbohydrates. Through these behaviors, Jamie lost a lot of weight and she got a lot of praise and positive feedback for that weight loss. So when she started these weight loss efforts, her BMI was in the obese BMI range at 35. And at the time that this case study takes place, her BMI was in the overweight range at 29. So right now, when this case study is taking place, Jamie's reporting that she has a lot of trouble concentrating in class. She feels weak and tired physically. She's really preoccupied by how much she hates her body. She can't stop thinking about how fat she is. She thinks about how her stomach looks in all her clothes. She's preoccupied with thoughts of food, so always thinking about what she last ate, what she's going to eat next, how many calories she needs to burn off. And she's really working hard to meet a goal of eating 100 or 1,200 calories per day. So based on this description, think about whether Jamie has an eating disorder, and if so, which one? She's not binging and purging, so she doesn't meet criteria for bulimia nervosa, or obviously binge eating disorder because she's not binging. She has a lot of the physical consequences of anorexia. She's weak and tired. She's really preoccupied with weight and shape, but she's not underweight. She's, in fact, her BMI is in the overweight range. So this is kind of an example of how the eating disorder diagnostic criteria, even though they're so specific and objective, they can still be a little bit arbitrary. So the disorder that Jamie would probably meet criteria for is atypical anorexia nervosa. And for one of the extra credit readings, you can read this essay by the woman pictured here, Zoe Jordan Salisbury, about her experience of being a fat person with atypical anorexia. So atypical anorexia is defined, anorexia nervosa is defined by being underweight, but it's also defined by this really extreme restrictive eating behavior and really intense preoccupation with weight and shape. So atypical anorexia nervosa is a diagnosis for people with the same thoughts and behaviors as people with anorexia nervosa, but without underweight. To be diagnosed with atypical anorexia, someone still has to have major weight loss. So it's still a disorder that involves extreme restrictive eating that leads to successful weight loss, which, as our guest speaker, Dr. Staley, talked about, is really only possible for a certain type of person, someone who's very goal-oriented, very driven, and very able to tolerate pain and discomfort in pursuit of a goal. So these are some quotes from Zoe Salisbury's article. So when she was in high school, she said that her eating disorder kind of flew under the radar because she was so busy and so high achieving. She graduated high school a year early. She was taking extra classes. And by all outward appearances, she seemed really successful. Um, in pursuit of her goal, which was losing weight and becoming thin, she was very rigid, very adherent, and very driven. She wrote, if I went over my calorie goal by even 10 calories, I would run on the treadmill in the garage until the treadmill said I'd burn the calories off. Sometimes I'd pass out during or after my workouts. So this is someone who has a goal and is willing to tolerate extreme amounts of pain and discomfort in pursuit of that goal. Talking about how her eating disorder flew under the radar when she was in college, she wrote, I was just so busy. I said, I was helping run a nonprofit. I was applying to law school. I was finishing my major and my minor. I was deeply involved with my photography classes and business. So what if I sometimes didn't have a chance to grab a meal before 8 p.m.? So these are all examples of that anorexia nervosa temperament that Dr. Asali talked about. Someone who has a goal and will do anything to achieve it, who can put aside short-term pleasure in pursuit of a long-term goal. The only difference between this person and someone with anorexia nervosa is really that she was overweight when she started her weight loss. And so the amount of weight that she lost wasn't enough to put her in the underweight range. Atypical anorexia nervosa is cognitively and behaviorally identical to anorexia nervosa. The only difference is basically someone's starting weight and how much weight they would need to lose in order to become underweight. Okay, so eating disorders are some of the most medically serious disorders that psychologists diagnose and treat. So anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any psychopathology that we've talked about or will talk about, with increasingly the exception of substance abuse disorder because of deaths by overdose. But aside from substance abuse disorder, anorexia nervosa for sure has the highest mortality. So mortality from eating disorders is kind of hard to study for a lot of reasons. But one reason is just the inability to follow people up all the way and from the beginning of the study until they actually die. So we don't actually know the exact mortality rate from anorexia nervosa, but in the studies that we do have, as many as 5% of people who get this diagnosis ultimately die from anorexia. As many as 1 in 5 people who die with anorexia, though, don't die from anorexia, they die from suicide. The causes of death from anorexia, when death is caused by the disorder itself, are consequences of starvation. And the most common causes are cardiac arrest and organ failure. Under-recognized causes of death in anorexia that can actually maybe be attributed to the disease itself are things like accidents. When you're under-eating, it impairs you cognitively. It's dangerous to drive. You aren't making good decisions. Your reaction time is slowed down. You're fatigued. You fall asleep really easily. You pass out easily. So people who are starving themselves are prone to dying in accidents, as well as infectious disease. So self-starvation seriously impairs your immune system and makes you more likely to catch and die from illnesses. The consequences of bulimia nervosa are a little bit different. Bulimia also has a high mortality rate compared to other psychopathology. About 2% of people who get this diagnosis die from bulimia. But compared to people with anorexia, more people die with bulimia nervosa from suicide, from overdose, from dangerous and risky behavior. This is a disorder that's very highly comorbid with borderline personality disorder and substance abuse. So some of the same reckless behaviors, dangerous substance use is seen in bulimia nervosa as is seen in borderline personality disorder. Medical consequences from bulimia include dental problems and damage to the esophagus from repeated vomiting, as well as the potential for bowel injuries from laxative abuse. So certain types of laxatives, especially or stimulant laxatives, like I believe Miralax is an example, but laxatives that work by stimulating the muscle contractions in your colon can actually cause nerve damage in your colon over time. You can develop dependencies on these stimulant medications in order for your colon to work. That is something that happens a lot in bulimia nervosa. There's also a risk of heart failure, heart attack in bulimia because of electrolyte imbalances caused by purging. Compared to the anorexia and bulimia, binge eating disorder has way fewer risks and it doesn't have elevated mortality. So most psychopathology doesn't kill you. It might increase your risk of dying from something else, but the disease itself, the disease process of the disorder doesn't contribute to death. So binge eating disorder doesn't have an elevated mortality rate, but there is an elevated risk of overweight and obesity and some of the physical health correlates of that, so diabetes and heart disease. But it's important to note that a majority of people with binge eating disorder who are overweight or obese were overweight or obese before they started binge eating. There's also, in binge eating disorder, one of the biggest risks is the risk of developing anorexia or bulimia. These are both really deadly, serious eating disorders, and people with binge eating disorder are at elevated risk compared to the general population for developing one of these eating disorders. Okay. Okay, so far we've talked about four disorders, anorexia nervosa, which has two subtypes, binge, purge, and restricting, atypical anorexia nervosa, which has all the same behaviors and symptoms as anorexia nervosa without the significant weight loss leading to underweight, bulimia nervosa, which involves binging and compensating without being underweight, and binge eating disorder, which involves binging without compensating. So in the next couple slides, I'm just going to talk about a couple alternate presentations of restrictive eating that are kind of the subject of a lot of debate in the field right now as to whether these are just sort of manifestations of anorexia or whether they represent a new disorder, a new diagnosis. So the first thing we're going to talk about is bigorexia, which is something that we've actually already touched on because this is considered right now a specifier, a diagnostic subtype of body dysmorphic disorder. It's not currently considered to be an eating disorder. So bigorexia is essentially a very strong drive to have bigger and bigger muscles. It involves dysmorphia about the body, which means not seeing yourself the same way other people see you, not being able to see yourself objectively. That's a feature of body dysmorphic disorder where people, if you remember, think that one of their physical features or one or more of their physical features is really, really ugly and that ugliness is really noticeable to other people in a way that it just objectively is not. People with bigorexia think that they are way skinnier than they are, and they have this very strong drive to put on muscle. So although this isn't currently considered an eating disorder, there is evidence for disturbed eating in bigorexia. People who are trying to build muscle have to eat a lot of protein, but people who are pathologically pursuing extreme muscularity at the expense of everything else eat a lot of protein, and this may lead to an imbalanced diet. Eating a lot of protein is also hard on your kidneys, and many people with this presentation engage in a lot of other eating behaviors that can be dangerous, like having a really, really high caloric intake. So although people with this disorder aren't trying to lose weight, they're not trying to be thinner, they're actually trying to gain weight and be bigger. They're trying to gain muscle specifically. So they might, similar to someone with anorexia, really avoid eating things like fat and sugar and really only focus on eating protein and maybe like vegetables. But because people who are trying to build muscle engage in a really, really high level of frequent exercise, even with the amount of food that they do eat, and they eat a lot, it can be difficult to compensate for the amount of calories that they're expending. So people with this presentation right now of body dysmorphic disorder can have some of the same physical consequences of an eating disorder. Something that's unique to bigorexia that we don't obviously see in anorexia nervosa is steroid abuse. So abusing anabolic steroids to try to put on muscle faster, that's really dangerous for your heart and metabolism. So it's considered a really pathological behavior because people are doing this in pursuit of muscularity at the expense of their physical health. People with other eating disorders don't abuse steroids, but they might abuse other medications like laxatives and diuretics in the case of bulimia, or diet pills in the case of anorexia. So steroid abuse in bigorexia doesn't make it that distinct or different from eating disorders. The distress and impairment that can come with bigorexia, aside from the dysmorphia and dysphoria about not being as muscular as they think they should be and perceiving themselves as thinner than they are, there's impairment that comes from just the sheer amount of time that you need to spend exercising and eating in order to build this much muscle. Injuries, overuse injuries, and pain from excessive exercise and dangerous weightlifting. The drug use, including steroid abuse, but also potentially like prescription painkiller abuse to deal with the constant injuries, and the body dysmorphia itself, which leads to a cycle of distress and continued overexercising. So bigorexia, even though the end result looks really different than the end result of anorexia, it actually shares a lot of the same cognitions and behaviors and the same extreme preoccupation with food, preoccupation with weight, and preoccupation with body shape that we see in anorexia nervosa. This is the perspective, of a famous bodybuilder talking about some of the physical sacrifices that bodybuilders make in pursuit of extreme muscularity and the type of temperament that it takes to be a successful competitive bodybuilder.
I think you have to be a little bit crazy to be extremely good at anything, really. You know, the average mindset is not going to make you number one in anything, in business, in any kind of sport, in bodybuilding, or anything. So you have to have an extraordinary amount of determination and passion for what you're doing. Of course, you have to have physical potential. But the guy that has the physical potential and the passion and the mental drive, then that's really when you've got a champion. And the guy with a bit more drive often can beat somebody with more physical potential. So it's when you get all those factors coming together, that's when you get a champion that's outstanding, I think. Well, let's be frank, we're all professional bodybuilders who use steroids, and there's some possible health risks for that. I wasn't worried about it. I was just being aware of it and try to keep an eye on my health with blood tests and so on and stuff like that. But I'll be honest, when I started, I can't remember who said it to me, but they're like, you know, you're doing this, maybe you're going to have health problems or maybe you're going to die young or something like that. But when you're 25, you don't give a shit. You know, when you're 25, you just want to be the best in the world and be Mr. Olympia. So when you get older, I think you start thinking about it more. Everyone when they're 25 thinks they're indestructible, you know?
Okay, so this basically this mindset, this temperament described that you need to have in order to be a successful bodybuilder is exactly the same temperament that you have to successfully lose an extreme amount of weight in time. So this extreme drive, desire to succeed in your chosen goal, and willingness to endure a lot of pain and put your physical health at risk in order to achieve that goal. It is required for both extreme bodybuilding and extreme weight loss anorexia. Another important thing that's similar is that not everyone can do this. Not everyone can be a successful bodybuilder. Not everyone can successfully achieve enormous amounts of weight loss and some body types and some physiology makes losing weight easier, just like some body types have an easier time putting on muscle. So there are a lot of parallels between extreme bodybuilding, which is associated with bigorexia, and extreme weight loss, which is obviously associated with anorexia. Bigorexia, so the drive to put on a lot of muscle and dysmorphia about how muscular you already are, is distinguished from what's sometimes called the male eating disorder presentation. So not all men with eating disorders have muscle dysmorphia features, although it is actually pretty common, but there's overlap between disordered eating and muscle dysmorphia in men. But the majority of men with restricting eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia will say that their goal for losing weight, the type of body that they want to have after they achieve the weight loss that they're suffering to achieve, is to be lean and muscular. Men with eating disorders will say that they're really focused on their percent body fat, whereas women with eating disorders are more likely to say that they're focused on being really thin, on being able to see visible bones like hip bones and collarbones and ribs, than they are to necessarily say that they want to appear lean and muscular, which is more common for men. This might be changing. There's actually not a lot of research on this, which I was surprised by when I was putting together this lecture, because definitely clinically we see this all the time. Women with eating disorders increasingly are saying that their initial goal in trying to lose weight was to be lean and fit, to look lean and muscular. Beauty ideals in the 21st century seem to be changing a little bit, moving away from extremely thin appearance, visible emaciation, looking kind of sickly and waif-like, which was a beauty ideal that was like pretty popular and caused a lot of public concern in the 90s, towards wanting to appear lean and toned. But it's important to note that although like professional models and celebrities are styled to appear healthy and fit instead of emaciated, they're all still extremely thin. And trends on social media like Fitspiration, which this picture is an example of, still encourage really unhealthy restricting behaviors and unhealthy exercise behaviors. It's just that the goal is to, supposedly the goal is to attain a muscular fit physique instead of to lose extreme amounts of weight. But in both cases, with whether the weight loss starts with the desire to be really skinny or the desire to be lean and muscular, once weight loss takes over, once the person experiences some success and positive reinforcement from their extreme weight loss, further weight loss and the prevention of weight gain becomes the goal, and appearance and health kind of take a seat to the side. When someone has anorexia nervosa, they no longer care about their health. They no longer care about their physical appearance. They're often aware that they're thinner than beauty ideals, that their body type is no longer considered attractive to most people. The goal just becomes continued weight loss and thinness. So this is the perspective of a man with an eating disorder, talking about the development of his eating disorder and how sort of the male eating disorder, the onset of eating disorders for men can look different.
Don't judge a book by its cover. Everyone's got demons. Everyone's got their troubles that they're struggling with. If I don't get to the big leagues, I'm a failure. I think when it first started was to not eat and to work out a bunch. Hey, that was going to get me really, really jacked. I was going to have no fat, be really muscular. I was going to be a man. And when I didn't see any results from not eating and working out a ton, I figured I wasn't doing it good enough. So now I need to eat less and work out more. Well, that's not working. So maybe I need to eat even less and work out even more. And that didn't work. And pretty soon, I was just withering away.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. You may have noticed this kind of temperament coming out that we've talked about before. If I don't make it to the major leagues, I'm a failure. He felt the need to be like the absolute best and the absolute top of his field of baseball. Like obviously most people who are good at baseball never accomplish what he accomplished of getting to the major leagues. But another important thing to notice is that once his eating disorder set in, it got in the way of him achieving his original goal. And that is exactly what we see with eating disorders, whether the original goal is to lose 10 pounds before your wedding, whether it's to cut out sugar and be healthier, whether it's to be a major league baseball player, whether it's to be able to put on a lot of lean muscle and have low body fat. That goal gets set aside once the eating disorder itself becomes reinforced, and the goal becomes just continuing to lose as much weight as possible and continuing to restrict your eating more and more.
Or 30.
Okay. So thinking about like the differences between bigorexia and this quote unquote male eating disorder presentation of pursuit of muscularity, so wanting to lose body fat and have a lean muscular appearance. Anorexia in both women and men often, almost always, starts with efforts to just lose some weight to be healthy, or to appear a little bit thinner, lose some weight to have a more socially acceptable body type, or to have a lean muscular appearance in both women and men. Women may be more likely to aim for a really thin appearance without being as focused on muscles, whereas men are more likely to want lean muscularity. But in both cases, when the disorder takes over, the behavior is no longer about achieving this body type. It's about just being as thin as possible. And once someone is at an unhealthy underweight, their original goals of looking good, of being a successful athlete are threatened. So by contrast, bigorexia focuses on attaining an unrealistically muscular physique as opposed to an unrealistically thin, lean physique. Both bigorexia and eating disorders, anorexia, involve extreme goal orientation, a perfectionistic temperament, and a really high degree of body dysmorphia, so not seeing your body the way other people see it, and body dissatisfaction, including a lot of preoccupation with weight and shape, whether that shape is really thin, lean and muscular, or extremely muscle-bound. Both of these types of disorders are dangerous, but for different reasons. So for both men and women, low weight anorexia causes bone density loss, it causes heart problems, it causes digestive problems, it causes muscle wasting. Whereas bigorexia involves steroid abuse and can cause things like kidney damage from excessive protein intake, as well as tons of injuries from extreme exercise. But both of these disorders, again, I would argue, are more similar than different, and they both involve this really goal-oriented, success-oriented temperament in order to actually achieve the goal of being really, really thin or really, really muscular. Okay, so another similar but different eating disorder presentation is Orthorexia Nervosa. Orthorexia is an extreme preoccupation with healthy eating, and it can involve things like really rigid, really compulsive eating behaviors with a lot of rules, a lot of distress about breaking those food rules, and a lot of preoccupation with food. So a lot of time spent thinking about what you just ate, what you're going to eat next, planning ahead, thinking about food that you can't eat because it's not healthy enough, thinking about what food you're going to eat. And so psychosocial impairment comes from this preoccupation with food, from distress about breaking food rules when it happens, and also by avoidance of eating opportunities. So when you're eating super clean and super healthy, it means that you might have to miss out on a lot of social events that involve eating if there's nothing healthy enough for you at the restaurant. Orthorexia can also involve medical impairment, because even if the goal of this extreme healthy eating isn't to lose weight, it can cause weight loss, and that weight loss can become unhealthy, or it can cause nutritional deficiencies. So an individual layperson's idea of what healthy eating looks like might not actually involve eating a nutritionally balanced diet. So orthorexia can cause both psychosocial and medical impairment. Unlike other eating disorders, it doesn't need to cause any kind of medical impairment to be diagnosed. So unlike anorexia, which requires medical impairment in the form of extreme weight loss and underweight, orthorexia can be diagnosed based on psychosocial impairment or medical impairment. It's also important to note that orthorexia is not currently a recognized diagnosis in the DSM. It's a diagnosis that's kind of under consideration, and that's being actively studied right now for potential inclusion in future editions. Okay, so here's a first-person perspective from a registered dietitian about her experience with Orthorexia Nervosa.
Wow. So when I was like 17 years old or so, I had just graduated from high school, and I sought out the help of a homeopathic practitioner to help me with some basic kind of digestive issues. So gas, bloating, digestive kind of pain or discomfort, all the kinds of things that we're talking and hearing about all the time on the internet, especially on YouTube. And her suggestion, of course, was to go on basically like a sugar detox, cutting out all the sugars in my diet, even the natural stuff. So I had always had like a generally balanced, healthy diet. I never really thought that much about food. I had never really dieted. My diet consisted of like a very healthy balance. Sometimes there were turkey burgers with salad. Sometimes there was grilled vegetables with a little steak, or pasta or a slice of pizza. I never overdid it. I never felt the need to kind of binge. I never obsessed over what I was eating. I just was eating ultimately intuitively, even though I didn't have a name for it then. I just was eating what felt good to my body. So my diet went from being relatively well balanced to a handful of really restrictive, clean eating foods. So big salads without dressing, and steamed vegetables galore, grilled chicken breasts and other really lean proteins, plain, no sauce, sugar-free Jell-O or other kind of diety products like that. And so, yeah, what started out as a desire to kind of kick a sugar habit very quickly spiraled into an overwhelming obsession and fear of all foods that I did not consider clean or healthy. And so this is what orthorexia is all about. Really, orthorexia is an obsession with clean eating, with healthy eating. And unlike other eating disorders like anorexia, where the concern is really on quantity of food, with orthorexia, it's all about quality or perceived quality, right? It's all about kind of eliminating those toxins or unclean foods from your diet. And even though it wasn't about weight loss for me, weight loss was never the goal. When I was eating such a small selection of foods and low calorie foods at that, I actually shed about 50 pounds on my already, pretty small natural frame. And the only thing more scary and up about that than the fact that like I'm really lucky to be alive right now is the fact that I was constantly being praised for my ultimately malnourished body and my commitment to clean eating. Honestly, I can't tell you how many times that people would, pat me on the back and because they saw what I was eating and tell me how good I was being and how bad they had been the night before for eating a Snickers bar. So basically, what I was being taught as a young 17-year-old girl was that my moral value was based on the food I was choosing to eat and my emaciated, controlled body. So anyways, at the same time, I was really falling into this anti-social cycle where my own fear of not having control over what I was going to be able to eat and my embarrassment over my disappearing body made me not want to go out with friends or make friends. But at the same time, being isolated and eating by myself only enabled my eating disorder and my disordered behaviors and my depressive thoughts. So for those of you who have struggled with disordered eating.
Okay. So I'm going to stop it right there. One thing that she said that I would kind of quibble with is that orthorexia is about quality of food and anorexia is about quantity. People with anorexia often will say that they're eating clean. They'll often say that they're cutting out sugar for health reasons. They'll often initially even start their restricted eating for that reason, but the weight loss for some people becomes really reinforcing and then the weight loss becomes the goal. It sounds like in her case, the weight loss was never the goal and it was never for her reinforcing, even though she got a lot of positive attention for it. But as we'll talk about throughout this lecture, a thin body type and the ability to lose weight is really prioritized in our society. So even if the weight loss that you experience because of clean eating is unintentional at first, for many people, clean eating or what starts out looking like orthorexia can turn into anorexia nervosa. But the important takeaway here is that eating restrictions that are motivated by a fear of unhealthy, impure, contaminated food can lead to a lot of the same consequences as eating restrictions that are really focused on not the food itself, but the consequences of the food on your body weight and shape. It's also important to note that what she's describing took a lot of effort, a lot of persistence, a lot of ability to defer pleasure, and a lot of focus on a long-term goal, which in her case was eating clean. But what she's describing is really the same temperament that we see in people with anorexia nervosa. So anyway, I kind of just said all this, but it is really common for anorexia to start with a sort of general vague goal of being healthier. And a lot of the foods that we consider unhealthy are also foods that are calorically dense. So if you cut them out, you often will lose weight if you're extremely rigid and adherent to that diet. There is a temperamental overlap between orthorexia and anorexia nervosa. People with both tend to be perfectionistic, they tend to be goal-oriented, able to make sacrifices and able to delay gratification in pursuit of a goal. Really, the only difference between orthorexia and anorexia is that orthorexia is not explicitly about weight loss. There's no drive for thinness. There's no distorted perception of the body. People with orthorexia don't think that they're heavier than they really are. And it's not driven by body dissatisfaction or concerns about shape and weight. Okay, so a discussion that I'd like to have in class, but I'll just sort of introduce it now, is at what point does changing the way that you eat and exercise in pursuit of physical health, whether or something like muscularity, become an eating disorder? How would you be able to tell? And if you were a clinician trying to diagnose this, what kinds of questions would you ask someone to try to understand whether they're engaging in disordered eating behaviors like binging, purging, and restriction, or whether they have disordered eating cognitions like body dissatisfaction, preoccupation with shape and weight, drive for thinness, body dysmorphia, preoccupation with food, and distress, shame, and guilt about eating. Okay, so now we're going to change tacks a little bit, and that was all kind of like the background information that you would have gotten from the textbook, just like what are the disorders. Now we're going to talk a little bit about where these disorders come from. And I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about why dieting is dangerous and contributes to eating disorders and ultimately doesn't work. Okay, so for right now, we're going to continue thinking about these disorders as the weight and shape family of eating disorders, although later on I might try to kind of pick away at that perception a little bit. Really important to these disorders and their maintenance is what's known as the binge, purge, restrict cycle. And for most people, this cycle will start with restrictive eating. So restrictive eating can be a feature of dieting. So just any effort to eat healthier, eat a little bit less, lose some weight, cut out sugar, cut out carbs. Dieting behavior for many people kind of backfires and leads to becoming increasingly preoccupied with food cravings for reasons that we'll talk about in the next couple slides. most people, especially people who don't have that extremely disciplined, perfectionistic driven temperament, will eventually give into those cravings and break their diet. Sometimes people who give in initially and break their diet will feel so much shame and guilt, feel like such a failure and have such black and white thinking, feel like, okay, I ruined the entire day. This day is a wash. This day was like not a good eating day. So I might as well just keep going. And that kind of thinking can turn into a binge. These same kinds of feelings, so failure, shame, guilt around eating, they tend to be intensified after binging. And often people respond to those feelings either by just doubling down on their diet and saying, I'll go harder tomorrow, I'll eat less tomorrow, I'll cut back tomorrow to compensate for today, or by purging. So in restricting anorexia and atypical anorexia, people will bypass this part of the cycle where breaking their diet leads to feelings of failure, feelings of shame, and those feelings of shame lead to binge eating. They might just skip right from breaking their diet to feeling guilt and self-loathing. Some people with anorexia, especially once the disease has progressed a lot, they are always preoccupied with food and always thinking about food, but they may never break their diet. So they might even bypass this part of the cycle and just go right from preoccupation with food cravings to believing that losing weight will make things better. But anyway, in atypical anorexia and restricting anorexia, this part of the cycle is bypassed. And then of course, in bulimia nervosa, people, in addition to responding to feelings of shame and guilt about breaking their diet or about binge eating by doubling down on restricting, they also try to compensate for those behaviors by purging. So that's bulimia nervosa and binge purge anorexia. This cycle also happens for people with binge eating disorder because many people, the majority of people with binge eating disorder are dieting, or they try to kind of compensate for their binges, not in excessive ways that would get them diagnosed with bulimia, but by eating better the next day. So the binge purge restrict cycle happens in every eating disorder, every weight shape eating disorder. It does not happen in ARFID. Okay, so we're going to focus on this part of the cycle for the next couple slides. So what causes this food preoccupation and food cravings in the context of dieting and restrictive eating? So the first driver of this is physiology. Hunger, so the subjective or the feeling that we have when our body is at a caloric deficit causes food cravings. In the last lecture, we talked about how hunger motivates food-seeking behavior and how food-seeking behavior is really highly reinforced because it was so important for our species' survival. And we also talked about how the feelings of hunger and feeling motivated to go out and find food, feeling food cravings is mediated by ghrelin, which is the hormone that our stomachs produce when we're low on calories or at times of day or in places and contexts where we're used to eating. So basically, it's really simple. The more you restrict your eating, the hungrier you get, and the hungrier you get, the more preoccupied with food cravings you will become, the more motivated you are to eat. If you let that motivation build up too much, it can lead to giving in really big ways, breaking your diet, even binge eating. The other piece is cognitive. So preoccupation with food cravings is not conducive to restricting your eating. It makes it hard to stick to a diet. It usually leads to breaking your diet. So people who are on a diet and trying to restrict their food intake will engage in a lot of thought suppression, where when they have these cravings, they really actively try to just like shove them down, distract themselves, not think about them. They might try really, really hard not to think about food in order to make it easier not to eat. But as we know from generalized anxiety disorder and other psychopathology, trying to suppress your thoughts always backfires. It leads to rebound, where once you stop actively trying to suppress, you get even more of the thoughts. And that rebound from unsuccessful thought suppression of food cravings and thoughts about food can trigger more thoughts about food and more cravings. So this figure comes from a study of rats that shows some of the physiological consequences of starving, of extreme restrictive eating. So this is a study where rats were fasted for a day. So they were not given access to food for a 24-hour period. In the first day after their access to food was restored, they ate about twice as much food as they did before fasting. So this 100 is the percent of their pre-fasting food intake that they were eating. So rats who were starved and then given access to food ate about 180% of their pre-starvation food intake the next day, which makes sense because, you know, they're compensating for missing food for a day. So maybe they should double their food intake the next day to compensate. Makes sense. But on the second and third day, these rats were continuing to overeat. They were continuing to eat a little bit past their pre-starvation food intake level. So this is showing that in an animal model, fasting triggers both binge-like eating behavior and continued overeating. Fasting really backfires. If your goal is to lose weight and to eat less, ironically, fasting, restricting, cutting calories really tends to backfire and make it actually harder to eat less, because physiologically and cognitively, it gives you a drive to eat more. So we talked about how, in the ARFID lecture, we talked about how food intake is in part regulated by subjective feelings of hunger and satiety. And like we just said, the hormone that's most involved in the feeling of hunger is ghrelin, which is produced by the stomach in response to caloric deficits. And the subjective experience of having high levels of ghrelin in your body is feeling hungry, feeling motivated to eat, feeling cravings. A hormone that does kind of the opposite and suppresses food intake is leptin, which is released by fat cells. Leptin kind of lets your brain keep track of how much fat store you have in your body. And when your eating is properly regulated and you're not leptin resistant, which can be caused by overweight and obesity, when there's more leptin in your blood, you have less motivation to eat and you become satiated faster. So ghrelin promotes intake and leptin suppresses intake. But in addition to intake, we also gain weight or lose weight because of energy expenditure. So expenditure has to do with the regulation of energy use in our body. One way of expending extra energy on purpose is by exercising or burning off calories, but there's also a lot of passive things that are happening in our body all the time that cause energy expenditure. So just at rest, because of the way that our bodies are functioning, the metabolic needs of our brain, of our muscles that are always moving, our bodies have a resting metabolic rate where we burn a certain number of calories every day just by existing, even if we didn't move around at all. We burn further calories by the effort that it takes to move our bodies around. So if you have a bigger body, you burn off more calories just by moving around and just by existing. Other passive ways of burning off energy through metabolism include body heat production. We burn calories to warm our bodies up. Cell energy expenditure, which is known as the cellular respiration rate. And the amount of expenditure differs both between and within individuals. So when you eat less, you expend less because your body knows that you're running at a deficit. Theoretically, when you have more fat stores in your body, you should expend more. But when your body is in a state of overweight and obesity, often it causes leptin resistance, which is where the leptin receptors in your brain get worn out and can no longer detect fat stores in your body. So because of all of this tight hormonal regulation of energy expenditure and energy intake, the body has a lot of ability to fight back against weight loss. It's important to remember that humans didn't evolve in an environment where obesity was even really a thing. We evolved as hunter-gatherers. We were not the top of the food chain. So in our evolutionary environment, we didn't really have the opportunity to overeat. And it was very difficult for us to gain enough weight to become overweight or obese. A bigger threat to our survival as a species at that time was starvation. So our bodies are really good at fighting back against starvation and preventing weight loss. Our bodies are not good at preventing weight gain or recognizing when we're running at a caloric excess. So what this slide is showing is ghrelin production before in the open circles and after people with obesity went through a weight loss program and lost about 20 to 30% of their initial body weight. So pretty significant weight loss. What this is showing is that ghrelin production is lower before losing weight than after losing weight. The body is recognizing that there's been weight loss, there's a caloric deficit, and it's responding to that caloric deficit by increasing hunger and increasing motivation to eat. Even though these people already had obesity, they're not starving to death, their body doesn't recognize that. Their body's only able to recognize caloric deficit and weight loss, not able to recognize weight gain. So the body fights back against that by promoting hunger, by increasing the subjective experience of hunger, which motivates people to eat more. This is a similar study showing how the body fights against weight loss. So this is people who successfully lost an average of about 22 pounds. This figure shows the trajectory of their weight loss. So they lost these 22 pounds in an 8-week intervention program where they ate a really low calorie diet and exercised a lot. Over time, and this is what we see with almost every weight loss study, their weight kind of crept back up, although they maintained some of their weight loss. Whoops. But what's happening here is that what's also creeping back up is their ghrelin production and their subjective experience of hunger. So before weight loss, they produced less ghrelin after a meal than they did after weight loss. The red line is immediately after their weight loss, so week 10 after a 10-week weight loss program. And the blue line is a year after their weight loss. So even a year later, their body still hasn't adapted to this new lower weight. Their body is still producing more and more ghrelin after a meal, which increases their subjective feeling of hunger and their drive to eat. This figure is from a meta-analysis of clinical trials of weight loss techniques. So what this is showing is that a year out from weight loss efforts, people are able to lose a pretty substantial amount of weight. The most substantial amount of weight comes from a very low energy diet, which is a medically supervised starvation diet, essentially, where people are eating like 900 calories a day for a year. So by doing that, you can lose a lot of weight. This is showing an average of about 11 kilograms of weight loss, which comes out to about 22 to 25 pounds. So even with that level of self-starvation, the amount of weight loss is relatively modest if you think about how high the starting weight would be for these studies. But for the majority of diets, the initial weight loss that comes from the active phase of the diet isn't really maintained over time. And the longer you follow people after a weight loss effort, the more likely they are to have returned to their baseline weight. What the black line is showing is basically a control condition. So this is people with obesity and overweight who were advised by their doctors to lose weight. As you can see, that does not work at all. What also doesn't really work for long-term weight loss or really any short-term weight loss is exercise alone. Diet alone is more successful. And if you maintain a lower energy intake, you can maintain some level of weight loss over time. But again, the weight rebounds and people tend to gain some or all of it back. The red line is Orlistat, which is a drug that prevents the body from metabolizing fat. The green line is diet plus exercise, which is actually not really that much more successful than diet alone. And again, this light blue line is a very, very extreme low energy diet that isn't medically sustainable. So the takeaway from this slide is that even when dieting does work, weight loss outcomes are relatively modest and they're not really maintained over a very long follow-up period. So if you look at people 6 months after they lost that weight, they might look like they've maintained a decent amount of weight loss, but if you follow them for another 2 years, many of them will be at or higher than their starting weight. And then again, even those who did successfully lose weight and maintain weight loss, the weight loss was pretty modest. So losing 8 kilograms is equivalent to losing about 17 or 18 pounds, which is great. And it's a pretty big accomplishment for many people, but it's not the amount of weight loss that people tend to have in mind when they embark on a diet. So this is actually the kind of weight loss that people are usually trying to achieve when they start with an obese BMI and embark on a diet. This is data from the TV show, The Biggest Loser, where people on a reality show sign up to basically compete to see who can lose the most weight in I believe a 6-week period, eating a 1,200 calorie diet and exercising for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Very, very, very extreme and not something that most people can do as part of their regular lives because it basically makes diet and exercise their full-time job. So as a result of this show, immediately afterwards, everyone loses weight. But what this figure is showing is that 6 years later, everyone from the show had regained some of the weight that they lost, and many had actually surpassed the weight that they were at when they started the show. And this study of Biggest Loser contestants actually looked at why this is. So when their metabolic rate was examined, when the number of calories they burn just by existing through heat production, moving blood around, brain metabolism, things like that, passive energy expenditure, what was found was that even though they had started to gain this weight back, their metabolism was still slowed down. Their metabolism was burning less energy at rest. This is an adaptive response to weight loss for a species that existed as hunter-gatherers, but it's basically showing that the body fights really hard against weight loss, making it very difficult to sustain. The more weight people lose, the more their metabolism slows in response, and the more they produce ghrelin in response. So they're burning fewer calories at rest, and they're increasingly motivated to eat and increasingly less satiated after meals. So the body fights really hard against weight loss. This is kind of a summary of the findings of that Biggest Loser study.
the story. Good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning, Robin. Even bigger than the big reveals we've come to expect on extreme weight loss shows is this new research that takes a look at what happens after the after pictures and how biology may actually play a bigger role than willpower when it comes to keeping the weight off.
We are inundated with weight loss before and after pictures and reality TV shows where overweight contestants end their seasons quite literally half the man or woman they used to be. But now a new study says if you're one of the many who regains weight after losing it, your body may be to blame. In a recent study, a group of scientists followed 14 of the 16 contestants from one season of The Biggest Loser, monitoring them for the 6 years after the show. They found that all but one of them gained the weight back. According to the study, while the contestants all had normal metabolisms for their size at the start of filming, years after it was over, their metabolisms continued to slow down, a mechanism the body uses to return to its original weight. Further compounding the problem, researchers found the contestants had plummeting levels of leptin, a hormone thought to help control hunger, which left them constantly feeling hungry.
After you lose weight, your body's metabolic rate will slow down. The number of calories that your body requires is going to decrease, and that's going to make it difficult for you to keep the weight off.
I've got my life back. I mean, I feel like $1,000,000.
Difficult for people like Season 8's winner Danny Cahill, 430 pounds before the show, 191 pounds after, but gained nearly 100 pounds back after he returned to work. And Dina Mercado, 248 pounds before the show, down to 173.5 pounds, now back to almost 206 pounds. The study found her metabolic rate now burns almost 438 fewer calories per day than would be expected for a woman her size.
Had I known what I know today, I probably would have not done the show. I didn't want anybody to know I was on The Biggest Loser because obviously I don't look like that anymore.
But J.D. Roth, co-creator and producer of The Biggest Loser, defends his show.
When the people leave our show, they are better off than being 400 pounds. I do think the study could have done things a little bit differently. I would have also liked them to take 14 people who kept the weight off. We need to use both to come up with the best way to be healthy because we all know we're still trying to figure it out.
In response to the study, producers of The Biggest Loser released this statement to ABC News saying the lead medical doctor on the show has been made aware of this most recent study and is in the process of evaluating its findings. And for those dieters who do blame themselves, this science may actually lift the biggest weight of all off of their shoulders.
Okay, so that really just reiterates the only way to lose weight is to expend more calories than you consume. But because of the body's metabolic adaptations to weight loss, the more weight you lose, the fewer calories your body burns at rest, and the more you need to cut back on food intake in order to continue losing weight. This makes extreme weight loss pretty unsustainable for a majority of people. And, you know, the show's like producer or whatever said that a better study would have followed 14 people who kept the weight off. But of the 16 contestants on that season of the show, only one contestant was able to keep the weight off. And that's actually despite experiencing the same metabolic slowdown that everyone else experienced. So a majority of people it's possible to lose an extreme amount of weight, but for most people, it's extremely difficult to keep it off because of the body's metabolic adaptations to weight loss, the body fighting back.
Melanie?
Okay, so a quick takeaway from this, you might be wondering, like, is this an anti-weight loss rant that I'm on? Is it bad to try to lose weight? So the takeaways from these last couple slides are that when weight loss is achieved through dieting and exercise, the weight loss tends to be pretty modest. So an average of 2 to 10 pounds of initial weight loss after the acute weight loss attempt. And then about 2 years later, about 50% of that lost weight is gained back on average. Some people keep it off, some people gain back more, but on average, people gain back about half of what they lost. Because even modest weight loss is hard to maintain because of metabolic changes, the metabolism slowing down and hunger increasing after weight loss. So most people who diet are dieting to really change their body shape and weight, not necessarily to lose 10 pounds. If you start at a weight of 250 pounds for a woman who's 5'6", that puts you in the obese BMI range. Losing 10 pounds and weighing 240 pounds changes your BMI, but it doesn't change the BMI range that you're in. 250 pounds and 240 pounds for a woman who's 5'6" are both in the obese range. So many people who initiate a diet are trying to change their obesity status. They're not trying to lose 10 pounds. The frustration from this modest weight loss that is even still hard to maintain can lead people to increased efforts to lose weight, as well as to a lot of like shame and guilt and self-blame and a problematic relationship with food. These efforts are accompanied by continued physiological changes, so increased fighting back against weight loss, and cognitive processes, so thought suppression, trying to forcibly not think about food, a lot of shame and guilt about your quote unquote inability to lose weight and keep it off, that in turn lead to increased preoccupation with food and increased hunger. So I'm not saying it's bad to want to lose weight or wrong to try, but the evidence shows that lifestyle changes that are made without necessarily the goal of losing a specific amount of weight can be more sustainable. They can definitely be less demoralizing, and they're less likely to lead to disordered eating. So adopting a healthier diet and lifestyle, while it doesn't lead to immediate weight loss, can improve eating behavior. It can improve someone's relationship with food. It can improve their level of control over their food intake. It can improve their nutrition knowledge, their ability to make healthy choices about eating. And it reduces the frustration that comes with constant dieting, where the goal is weight loss and that goal is not achievable. These types of changes over the long term can actually lead to modest weight loss, as much as 5 to 10% of a person's starting weight over a longer period of time. And there is some evidence that when weight is lost over a longer period of time through sustainable changes to diet and lifestyle, not through temporary extreme diets, that weight loss is more sustainable and it's less likely to lead to metabolic adaptations to fight back. So this slide just contains some of the evidence-based recommendations from the literature on making healthy changes and engaging in healthy weight management. So one of the most important things is to maintain a regular eating schedule. Eat basically the same number of times at the same times, basically the same amount of food every day in a way that fits your schedule. But in addition to that, it's also important to eat when you're hungry, not to restrict, not to let yourself experience that buildup of hunger and motivation to eat that leads to giving in and overeating, that leads to that binge, purge, restrict cycle. So regular eating on a schedule actually helps to regulate hunger cues and teaches people to recognize when they're feeling hungry and to distinguish that feeling of hunger from things like boredom, stress, or food cravings. It's not advisable to cut anything out of your diet. Diets that make you feel deprived or that make you feel like you're giving up on something are harder to maintain. But it is possible to cut down on things like sugar, salt, and alcohol, which all contribute to weight gain. The easiest way to cut back on things is to add stuff in, not take stuff away. So rather than cutting out all sugar, add more fruits and vegetables and fresh unprocessed foods. Many people find it easier to cut back on sugar and salt by eating less processed foods. So learning to cook at home and starting to understand the basics of food shopping, cooking, and nutrition. Changes that add to your life and don't take something away are easier to maintain. So when people are trying to make healthy changes, it's important for them to add foods that they enjoy and add types of physical activity that are fun and enjoyable and that enhance their life, that don't take away from their life. So rather than thinking about losing out on your after work relaxation time by going to the gym every day, think about adding something to your life, like taking a class with people that you know, playing sports with friends, doing some kind of at-home exercise while you're watching your favorite show, something that adds to your life, doesn't detract. But the important thing, eating disorders are rigid, they're inflexible, they're extremely goal-oriented, they're single-minded. So changes that are flexible, small and incremental, are changes that are less likely to lead to that kind of disordered eating thinking. So experts recommend not eliminating any food or food group, adding, not subtracting, making small changes, one thing at a time, not making huge changes because those are harder to maintain. And again, adding things, not taking things away. So these are just sort of the evidence-based recommendations for making healthy changes to eating. They may or may not lead to weight loss, but there is evidence that shows that even if they don't lead to weight loss, changes like this can lead to major health improvements. So these figures, just as an example, are from a study of the effects of increased physical activity in people who lose weight, in people who maintain their weight, and in people who gain weight after the intervention. So people who maintain their weight at an overweight BMI but increase their physical exercise, experience fewer changes over time in cardiac risk factors like hypertension, hypercortisolemia, so high cortisol, or sorry, hypercholesterolemia, so high cholesterol, metabolic syndrome, which is a combination of things like insulin and leptin resistance that leads to dysregulated blood sugar and can increase the risk of diabetes, less risk of diabetes, and less inflammation. So increased physical activity and other changes like lowered sodium, reduced alcohol intake, improve cardiac and metabolic risk factors even without weight loss. But modest weight loss also has a lot of these benefits too. Okay, so getting back to disordered eating. So eating disorders and subclinical eating behavior are most common in people with overweight and obesity. Obviously, the exception to that is anorexia nervosa itself, because it requires that people be underweight. But every subclinical eating disorder, atypical anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, all of these are associated with being overweight or obese. Being overweight is a risk factor for disordered eating. And that's most likely because people who are overweight are constantly being encouraged by friends, family, doctors, the culture itself to diet and to try to lose weight. There's this perception that if you're fat, you should want to lose weight. That's what our culture tells us. Women are more subject than men to unrealistic body image standards and to being objectified and judged based on their appearance alone from a really early age. And this helps to explain why women at a younger age, in childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, have much higher rates of disordered eating than men. But interestingly, as men and women get older, women's risk for eating disorder symptoms and diagnosis kind of stays stable and then starts to decrease over their lifespan. Whereas for men, the risk of disordered eating actually increases as they enter their 30s and middle age. And that's most likely because at these ages, men are experiencing weight gain, which is a natural part of aging. And for the first time, they're starting to experience this pressure to look different, to lose weight that women have experienced all their lives. Pressure to lose weight, pressure to be thin, and pressure to diet absolutely contribute to disordered eating. Weight stigma plays a really big role in this. So weight stigma is defined as bias or weight-based discrimination or stereotyping based on a person's weight. Some examples of anti-fat stereotypes are that fat people are lazy, lack willpower, less educated and intelligent. None of these things are true. Science has actually shown that body weight is absolutely unrelated to all of these personality traits. But these are some examples of the types of stereotypes that exist about fat people in our culture. And people with overweight and obese BMIs are exposed to the stigma and even have internalized it themselves. So overweight, obese people, fat people, people differ on the preferred terminology, but currently the preferred terminology is fat because overweight and obese are medical terms and they're believed to contribute to the stigma. So anyway, fat people have often internalized the stigma themselves. So the more weight stigma someone experiences, according to longitudinal research comparing people with the same BMI but different levels of exposure to weight stigma, the more weight stigma someone experiences, the higher their risk is for further weight gain. So why does that happen? Well, being overweight and being more exposed to stigma increases the likelihood that someone will try to diet. But as we saw in those previous couple slides, dieting tends to backfire. It leads to increased hunger, increased preoccupation with food. And this can lead to entering into that binge, purge, restrict cycle. So for some people, this increased hunger and preoccupation with food leads to binge eating. For some people, it just leads to breaking their diet and breaking their food rules. That can in turn lead to a lot of distress, a lot of shame, doubling down on restricting or doing things to compensate, like purging or excessively exercising or fasting. So for some people, this can turn into an eating disorder, but for many more people, it's just a lifelong cycle of unsuccessful dieting and subclinical disordered eating. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about not so much weight stigma, but the alternative, what society is telling us our bodies should look like. So this figure shows opposite trajectories. So over time, across the end of the 20th century, the average American woman was getting bigger. The average BMI was increasing. And actually, since the 90s, the average BMI for women has been in the overweight range for young women, ages 22 to 29. At the same time, the average BMI of, or not the average BMI, the actual BMI of winners of the Miss Universe pageant has gone down. So our idealized female beauty archetypes are getting thinner as real women are getting bigger over time. This is also reflected since the beginning of the 21st century, from the late 90s to a couple of years ago, with Victoria's Secret models getting increasingly thin, having increasingly narrow waists, and having increasingly smaller dress sizes. So in the same period of time, from 1995 to the late 2010s, I guess you would say, beauty standards have changed. So we've gone from idealizing this kind of like emaciated, waif-like, heroin chic body type to emphasizing a curvier, leaner, and stronger physique for women. But it's important to note that both of these beauty archetypes are unattainable for most people. And in order to try to attain them, most people would have to attempt to lose weight by restricting their food intake and increasing their energy expenditure, because on average, most people are overweight. So we've talked about women's body beauty image standards and body archetypes, but this definitely affects men too. Chris Pratt and John Krasinski are just two examples of male actors who've gotten a lot of attention in recent years for losing a lot of weight really quickly. This is kind of just an example of the tone that's taken around their weight loss. The Chris Pratt one in particular is just like so egregious. 25 celebrities who were 6s and are now 10s. Basically, they're saying that the only difference here is that he's thinner and that made him substantially more attractive. Also, this amount of body fat loss in a 4-month period really can only be accomplished through pretty excessive, extreme means, and it's being glorified here. So there has been research that suggests, again, since the 90s, our beauty standards are changing. In the 90s, this was kind of like the peak of public concern about the thin ideal and the way it was being portrayed. There was this aesthetic known as heroin chic, where models and actresses were sort of styled to look really sickly and really emaciated. And basically the goal was to look as thin as possible. And so lighting, photography, fashion was all kind of designed to emphasize aspects of extreme thinness. By contrast, in 2020, in the people that we consider to be like archetypes of male and female beauty, there's more diversity in a lot of ways. So better representation of non-white ethnic and racial groups and LGBTQ plus people, but there is still very little diversity of body types. Despite this change in preference from like women, especially appearing really thin and emaciated, to appearing curvy, muscular, lean, and strong, both of these body types are unattainable for the average man or woman. That's kind of the important takeaway. While there has been an increase in diversity in a lot of ways in the people that we consider beautiful, there has not been any increase in diversity of body types. At the same time, Americans have gotten bigger and bigger. So this is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. This is an example of the heroin chic aesthetic. This is a recent Calvin Klein underwear ad. Both of these models have really thin BMIs, and the main difference here is in the styling, whether they're styled to appear kind of fit and muscular or sickly and emaciated. Either one of these looks is unattainable for 95% of people. Okay, and this does have an impact on how people see themselves. So this is a study of straight college women who were asked, what female body type matches your current body type the most? Which female body type do you think your male peers find the most attractive? Which body type do you personally find the most attractive? And which body type are you aiming for? Which body type would you like to look like? So women on average believe that their body is bigger than what other women and other men would find attractive. Interestingly, they think that what men find attractive is a little bit bigger than what other women find attractive. But most strikingly of all, the body type that they say that they're aiming for is actually thinner than what they think men find attractive and what they themselves think is attractive, and what they think other women think is attractive. Okay. I also want to bring racial and ethnic differences into this a little bit, because in the United States, there are definitely lower rates of anorexia nervosa, despite there being similar rates of subclinical disordered eating, as well as similar rates of bulimia nervosa and binge eating in women of color. What this actually looks like in practice is really similar symptoms. So restrictive eating, dangerous dieting, preoccupation with weight and shape, purging, compensatory behavior. The only real difference is that women of color with eating disorders are less likely to be underweight. One reason for this that has been proposed is that there are different beauty ideals and different beauty standards for women of color and white women. But what I'm going to argue later in this lecture is actually probably what's happening here is the intersection of race and socioeconomic status in the United States, and that this finding is really just a proxy for the fact that women of color are more likely to be in lower socioeconomic status groups. When you control for socioeconomic status, disordered eating behaviors look similar across racial and ethnic groups. But it is definitely true that Black women specifically are exposed to different types of pressure to look a certain way. So this is an example of that from a qualitative study of Black college women at a Southeastern US university. This particular university happened to have a majority white student body. So many of these women talked about how they perceive different beauty standards for Black women and for white women, and how because they're Black women living in an environment with mostly white women, they kind of struggle to conform to both of these types of images, even if they're not totally compatible with each other. But again, the important takeaway is that even if, as these women are saying, being a little bit more shapely, being a little bit thicker is considered attractive for Black women and in Black culture, it's still unattainable for most people. It's still thinner than most women actually are. And to look that way, most women would have to engage in really restrictive eating and really cut back on their energy intake. Okay, so some takeaways from this society, culture, fat stigma. Everyone is exposed to cultural expectations of what an ideal body looks like, both men and women, people of every race. Despite there being ethnic and cultural differences, as well as changing cultural standards of what we consider beautiful in women and men, the ideal body type for both women and men is still thinner than most people's natural body type, and people have to diet in order to attain it. But as we've talked about, dieting isn't successful for the majority of people. So for some, this effort to achieve an ideal body type that's kind of out of reach for them leads to a cycle of restricting and giving in that can look like chronic dieting, yo-yo dieting, or that can turn into binge eating disorder. Some people respond to binges and giving in with compensatory behavior, which can turn into bulimia nervosa. And some people, a very small subset of people, have the driven, perfectionistic, goal-oriented, pain-tolerant temperament that actually allows them to successfully, quote unquote, pursue the thin ideal by losing substantial amounts of weight. And these are people who are at really high risk for anorexia nervosa and atypical anorexia. Okay, so I just spent some time talking about how the thin ideal and fat stigma really contributes to disordered eating behaviors in the modern United States. But historically, interestingly, anorexia nervosa has always existed, but it really hasn't always seemed to be about weight. So I'm going to just give a brief history of what anorexia has looked like throughout history and give you sort of my take on how anorexia in modern United States came to be so focused on pursuit of thinness and control of weight and shape. Okay, so going way back to the Middle Ages, early Christians showed their piety by showing that they were really neglecting their physical bodies and their lives on earth in favor of focusing on their spiritual lives and their lives in heaven. So some people took this neglect of their physical bodies further. In order to emulate the suffering of Jesus, men would engage in self-mutilation, so like whipping themselves, and women would engage in self-starvation. So both of these were acts that were intended to show that the person doing it didn't care about their physical body. They weren't attached to their body. They weren't attached to the earth, and they wanted to suffer like Jesus suffered to show their faith. And fasting does remain an important part of Catholic religious rituals, as well as religious rituals in many religions and cultures. And asceticism is still practiced in Catholic religious orders, although now the way that people show their neglect of their physical body is through vows of poverty, not through self-mutilation or self-starvation, just fasting and poverty. But anyway, that's a brief history of the relationship between the early church and fasting behavior. So in the Middle Ages, there are historical examples of women who had a disease known as holy anorexia. These are women who restricted their food intake because they wanted to be undesirable to men. These were women who wanted to take vows of chastity and become nuns, but because they were noble women, they were being pressured to marry. In order to prevent being married off, these women would starve themselves. They would refuse to eat. They would lose substantial amounts of weight, and they would stop menstruating, which meant that they were not marriage material because they couldn't have children. So an example of this was Saint Wilga Fortis. She lived in like the 700s AD. She took a vow of virginity, but her father, who was a king, wanted to marry her off. So Saint Wilga Fortis, the like legend goes, she prayed to God to take her beauty away, but she actually took the initiative herself to take her beauty away by starving herself. She stopped eating, she stopped menstruating, and according to the legend, she grew hair all over her body. So she's often depicted with like a full beard, as you see here. But actually, in people with anorexia and people who are engaging in self-starvation, there's a phenomenon known as languor, which is the growth of really fine, thin hair all over the body. It's an adaptation just to starvation. It's thought to have sort of adapted to help keep our ancestors a little bit warmer when we were starving and didn't have as much energy to burn off as heat. So anyway, it's highly likely that Saint Wilga Fortis didn't actually have a beard. She probably had a lot of hair growth all over her body as a result of her self-starvation. Another example of holy anorexia is Saint Catherine of Siena, who lived in the 14th century. And similarly to Saint Wilga Fortis, she didn't want to be married. So she tried to make herself less beautiful and less desirable by cutting her hair off and starving. She was successful in this and she was able to become a nun. And actually throughout her life, she was a very powerful person. She was really influential in religious communities. And she actually had a lot of influence over the Catholic Church. And she had a relationship with the Pope where she was like kind of a spiritual advisor to him. Catherine was very pious and she engaged in really extreme religious fasting. The way that she did this was that she took communion every day. And at the time in the Catholic Church, you had to fast for a certain amount of time before and after taking communion. So because she was taking communion so often, she was fasting all the time. So in her extreme piety, she was engaging in fasting behavior. And it got to the point where her religious superiors, like other nuns in her order, the priests and bishops that she had working relationships with, became really concerned about her health and advised her to stop fasting and stop taking communion so often. But she refused. And by the time she was 29, she started to say that she was like physically unable to eat. She claimed that she had an illness that made her unable to tolerate food and that she couldn't even swallow. What might have been happening is she might have been experiencing gastroparesis, which is a long-term consequence of self-starvation, where the muscles in your digestive system basically become deconditioned through lack of use, and you stop being able to digest food as efficiently. This can lead to feeling early satiety, so feeling full after taking just a few bites, and vomiting up food because it's not passing through your digestive system. So St. Catherine died from a stroke at age 33, and this type of death can be caused by malnutrition. So she's another example of a woman who initiated self-starvation for religious motives, as well as in order to take control of her life, not wanting to be married. Actually, I should mention that Saint Wilga Fortis is the patron saint of abused women. So women, Catholic women in abusive marriages, prayed to Saint Wilga Fortis for kind of strength to bear their lives, because she is seen as someone who avoided marriage and all the dangers that came with it through her self-abnegation. So holy anorexia has many parallels to anorexia nervosa. It started for women when they were in their late teens. In the case of holy anorexia, it often began with efforts to avoid forced marriage, and it was accompanied by other acts that were intended to make the woman less physically desirable and less beautiful. So things like cutting off her hair, like trying to dress in sort of impoverished clothing, efforts to be less desirable to men in order to avoid marriage. There are theories and some anecdotal evidence, really a lot of anecdotal evidence from patients who say that their restrictive eating gives them a sense of control and agency over their lives. This is certainly what was happening with women in the Middle Ages who didn't have any control or agency, and really the only way that they could stop themselves from being married was to try to make themselves sexually undesirable or physically incapable of bearing children. So for them, eating was literally a way to take control. Not eating was literally a way to take control over their lives, and the only way that they could. Anorexia also, in modern times, often begins with efforts at self-improvement, like weight loss and healthy eating. Whereas for some of these women, like St. Catherine, anorexia could have begun with efforts at religious self-improvement, so efforts to be able to take communion more often. She had to fast. Women who had holy anorexia engaged in extreme piety and acts of devotion, even beyond what was normative for pious women at the time. So like St. Catherine, even other nuns thought that she was taking it a little bit too far. And in fact, she got to the point where her restrictive eating interfered with her ability to participate in religion, because when she stopped being able to eat anything at all, she also stopped being able to take communion. Similarly, with people who have anorexia today, restrictive eating eventually goes beyond the original goal of the restrictive eating. If the original goal was health, anorexia takes away your health. If the original goal was to look great on your wedding day, anorexia takes that away too. From St. Catherine, anorexia took away her ability to be a religious leader and engage in communion. Women with holy anorexia, just like people with anorexia today, were described as having really perfectionistic, goal-oriented temperaments. They were really high achieving, like St. Catherine being an advisor to the Pope, and they were able to tolerate a lot of pain and a lot of deprivation in pursuit of their goals, just like women and men today with anorexia. I also want to just quickly mention early spiritualist theories of anorexia. So holy anorexia wasn't actually seen as a disorder, it was seen as an act of extreme piety. But throughout history, self-starvation has also been attributed to demonic possession. And there's a lot of historical cases of this that also, similar to anorexia, started in young women. So it's possible that some of these like medieval and more recent historic cases of demonic possession could have also been cases of anorexia. And one example of this was Anneliese Michel, who was a Belgian woman who died during an exorcism from self-starvation. Okay, so moving forward in history a little bit to the Victorian era. This was when anorexia was quote unquote discovered by two male physicians. Working independently, both of these physicians described an illness that affected young women, so between ages 16 and 23, which is the age of onset for anorexia, involved self-starvation and food refusal, was associated with a ton of anxiety, and involved a lot of physical activity despite malnutrition. So people with anorexia are often very, very physically active. It's a way of burning off calories. These women were engaging in the same behavior. These medical descriptions weren't the first descriptions of anorexia, but they were the first psychological theories of the disorder. So they weren't attributing it to a physical cause. They weren't attributing it to demonic possession. They were attributing it to mental and psychological processes. The two physicians did propose two different reasons or etiologies, ways that this self-starvation started. Charles Lesage, I believe is how you pronounce his name, was a French physician who described anorexia as beginning with the desire to, as he put it, avoid pain. So he believed that women with this disorder were just extremely intolerant of pain and discomfort, including discomfort from eating, and that over time, persistent self-starvation and food refusal develops into an actual aversion to food. The English physician who described it just attributed it to hysteria, which was kind of a catch-all diagnosis for any psychological problems that women had. Importantly, though, neither of these physicians mentioned intentional self-starvation as a way of trying to lose weight. So self-starvation to lose weight was not part of the original conceptualization of anorexia nervosa in the late 1800s. And in fact, it wasn't even until the 1960s that scientists first started talking about a connection between drive for thinness or efforts to lose weight, fear of weight gain, and anorexia nervosa. And preoccupation with shape and weight and drive for thinness were not part of the diagnostic criteria in DSM until the 80s. So why is this? Some people put all the blame on the thin ideal. So they say that society has increasingly been telling women, especially, but also men, that they need to be thin. And as society becomes more advanced and as technology and the media become more pervasive, we have greater and greater exposure to the thin ideal. So people sometimes point the blame at Twiggy, who was a famous model in the 60s. She was known for being extremely thin, but thinness in women has been glorified and considered attractive for a really long time. These are just famous women from the 20s through the 60s. While Twiggy may have been especially extra thin, all of these famous actresses and models were thin. So thinness in models and actresses has been popular since before the first descriptions of anorexia nervosa. And women have been expected to maintain a relatively slim figure for a really long time. women's beauty ideals haven't involved like a lot of curvaceousness and roles since the Renaissance. So women have been experiencing pressure to be thin for a long time, yet thinness was not part of the diagnostic picture of anorexia nervosa until the 80s. So others have proposed that the explanation for this is the advent of diet culture and increasing societal pressures, both to be really thin, but also changes in society that have made it difficult to be thin and that have promoted obesity and weight gain. So starting in the 1950s and 60s, food portions started becoming bigger and bigger, and the caloric density of popular foods was increasing. At the same time, lifestyles were becoming more sedentary, so men's and women's occupations were increasingly likely to involve sitting for long periods of time and less likely to involve moderate physical exercise and labor. That's what this is showing. So on average, we went from about 50% of jobs requiring moderate physical activity to less than 20% in 2010. Starting in the 70s, we started to see a rise in obesity rates. And interestingly, it was actually just obesity that was increasing. It's not, there haven't really been similar increases in overweight. So that's what this figure is showing too. This is the share of the population that's obese, and this is the share of the population that has extreme obesity, which is a BMI over 40. So starting in the 70s, obesity started to become more and more of a problem. And that's likely due to these changes that started earlier in the 50s and 60s, food being more calorically dense, jobs being less physical. Also, it's likely to have started with dieting and weight loss efforts in the 50s and 60s. So again, even back then, even before anorexia nervosa was recognized as a disorder of extreme motivation to be thin, women were pressured to be thin. So women during pregnancy engaged in dieting behaviors, smoked, did things to keep themselves from gaining weight. That causes babies to be born at a low birth weight. And babies who are born at a low birth weight have a phenomenon known as catch-up growth in childhood that's associated with rapid weight gain, and that's a huge risk factor for obesity. So many of the dieting, thin-oriented behaviors that pregnant women were engaging in the 50s and 60s actually set their children who were born in those decades up to start gaining weight when they were adolescents in the 70s. So starting in the 70s, but continuing today, it's becoming harder and harder for normal people to match the thin beauty ideal. And as that happened, weight loss diets became increasingly popular. So the position that I tend to agree with is that preoccupation with weight and shape and drive for thinness are a product of diet culture, but also a product of an obesogenic food environment and lifestyle in the United States that makes it very difficult for average people to be thin and to even come close to achieving this thin ideal. Okay, it's not that simple though. Social class also plays a role, and the standard of living in the United States, starting in the 70s at the same time that obesity prevalence was beginning to increase, the standard of living for the middle class and working class in America has been falling. Poverty has been, wages have been stagnating and not catching up with the cost of living. So more and more people are experiencing poverty, deprivation, and hardship in the United States. At the same time, more and more people are becoming overweight and obese in the United States. So this, again, this is a slightly older figure, but this is the obesity rate by county in the United States. And this was true in 2008, it's still true today. Obesity rates are really high in the rural South and the rural Rust Belt and Midwest. If you overlay this with median income, you kind of see a lot of similarities in regions. The same regions that have very low median income, especially in the South, also have extremely high rates of obesity. So putting them side by side, we can really see that in places where income is low, obesity is high. And research also shows that social class is linked to obesity and overweight in the United States. And in fact, differences in social class and the intersection of race and income largely explain racial and ethnic differences in overweight and obesity. So why is this? Why does social class relate so strongly to weight and obesity? One important thing to think about is food insecurity, which is defined as not being able to afford enough food or the right kinds of food to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So in 2019, before the pandemic, the prevalence of food insecurity in the United States was 12%. It's higher in Alabama, 16%. And here in Mobile County in 2019, the prevalence of food insecurity is 18%, which is almost 1 in 5 people in Mobile not able to afford enough food. People who are food insecure are more likely to have eating disorder symptoms, including restricting, preoccupation with weight and shape, binge eating, and compensating. So food insecurity is a major risk factor for disordered eating. Since the pandemic, the prevalence of food insecurity has gone up dramatically throughout the United States. This is just a nationally representative sample. So in states like Alabama that were already more food insecure than the general United States, these numbers are even worse. But as you can see from this figure, the impact of the pandemic on food insecurity was different for white people and people of color. So people of color were more impacted by the pandemic in terms of losing food security. In addition to food insecurity, poverty is associated with living in food deserts. So food deserts are defined as areas where healthy, fresh foods are not accessible. And this is another map of the United States showing that in the same areas where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of obesity, there are also a lot of people who don't have easy access to a supermarket, who don't have a car and don't have a supermarket within walking distance. People who live in food deserts are more exposed to fast food because fast food restaurants, corner stores, and bodegas tend to come in and take the place of supermarkets and fresh food in providing food for these areas. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between being food insecure and living in a food desert. So poverty causes obesity, and it does this by creating what's known as an obesogenic food environment. In the United States, unhealthy food, like fast food, is cheaper on a per calorie basis. So I just did this really quickly. A meal of a cheeseburger and French fries costs $3 for 1,000 calories. Whereas what you might consider like a healthy meal of grilled chicken breast, rice, and broccoli costs a little bit less, about $2.60, but for half as many calories. So unhealthy food is cheaper per calorie. It's also important to note that unhealthy food, like fast food, is way more accessible in food deserts where there's no access to grocery stores. I got these prices from the websites of Target and Walmart. So, but if you don't have access to those stores, if you don't have a car and don't have a supermarket or superstore within walking distance, you might find yourself buying food at corner stores and bodegas where food prices are much higher than in grocery stores. Also, what this is kind of neglecting is, in addition to the cost in dollars of getting this food, there's also the time that it costs to purchase all these raw ingredients, prepare them, cook them, and eat them at home. It's cheaper and easier to get your calories from fast food than it is to get your calories from fresh, unprocessed foods. In the United States, the government provides assistance for people who can't afford food in the form of food stamps. But it's well known that food stamps and food assistance is not adequate to comfortably feed a family. The majority of food stamp recipients are still food insecure. Food stamps aren't enough. But rather than providing more aid, instead, the government provides education about budgeting. So rather than making sure that people have enough money for food, the government just gives like helpful tips, like make a food budget, determine how often you'll shop, preferably no more than once a week. Write a list of foods your family likes and keep it taped inside the kitchen cabinets. Make enough menus for a 2-week cycle. Plan for breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, or 5 to 6 mini meals per day. Next to each meal, write the ingredients you need to prepare it. Inventory the foods you have on hand and what you need to buy. Know what you have in your refrigerator and freezer at all times. Plan to use these foods in your menus to save money. Write a weekly meal plan. Start with a simple plan that includes your family's main meal of the day. Check grocery store ads for sale items that you can use in your menus. These are things that food secure people don't have to do. Not saying it's bad to budget or that some food secure people don't do these things, but this is way more thought, effort, and energy going into making sure that you have enough food than people who have money and food security need to expend. It also kind of neglects the fact that like not everyone can make one meal for everyone in their family. Some families have different nutritional needs. Some families have kids with ARFID or who are picky eaters. So the solution to food insecurity that our government is providing right now is unrealistic. It's not really helping people. On top of just a lack of financial access to food itself, there's also the kinds of spaces and environments where people who live in poverty are living. So these are two Craigslist ads for apartments in Mobile with rent less than $800 a month. These are just some examples of the very different, the range of spaces that people on a fixed income can afford. So I'm not saying that it's impossible to have access to a pretty nice kitchen if you have a low income, but there's a lot of barriers to renting an apartment and finding a space to live. In addition to having enough money to pay for first and last month's rent, you might have to pay for application fees. You might have to have a lot of government issued IDs. You might have to have a steady job that provides things like pay stubs and W-2s so that you can prove your income. This apartment that has fewer barriers to rental, the kitchen arguably is not as nice. The space itself is a little bit older and not as well maintained. And this apartment doesn't include a refrigerator. So eating healthy requires time and resources that go well beyond just affording the food itself. Eating healthy is a lot easier if you have a well-stocked kitchen, if you have all the staple ingredients in your house that you need for cooking, if you have working kitchen appliances, if you have access to a kitchen at all times and aren't sharing it with other people, if you have the time, energy, and knowledge that it takes to prepare healthy meals. Cooking at home takes a lot of knowledge and experience, and a lot of people don't feel very comfortable in the kitchen, don't feel confident that they can take raw ingredients and turn it into a meal that they'll actually enjoy eating. So like meal delivery services, if you listen to podcasts, you probably have heard hundreds of ads for HelloFresh and Blue Apron, many of which emphasize that meal delivery services are a way of building comfort in the kitchen, learning about nutrition, learning how to cook. These are not affordable or accessible for most people, however. So food insecurity, housing insecurity, limited control over the appliances that you have in your kitchen because you're a renter, living with more people, sharing kitchen space, lacking nutrition knowledge, lacking the time, energy, and emotional resources to deal with budgeting, clipping coupons, planning meals for your entire family for 2 weeks. All of this kind of sets people up to quote unquote fail and end up engaging in less healthy eating behaviors that promote obesity. Social class leads to obesity in other ways too. So as we've talked about in this class, poverty is a major stressor, and stress leads to weight gain both via eating behavior, so stress eating. If I'm having a horrible, stressful day, I'm more likely to just go to McDonald's and get something quick than worry about cooking a full, healthy meal at home. Stress also leads to weight gain indirectly via chronic illness, making people's lives more sedentary. It's recommended to engage in 30 to 45 minutes of moderate physical activity every day in order to prevent weight gain. But this is a lot harder if you are working lots of different jobs, if you work nights, if you don't live in a neighborhood with access to safe outdoor spaces, or if you don't have a car or can't afford a gym membership, if you have a lot of family responsibilities that keep you home because you can't afford daycare for your kids or a nursing home for your elderly relatives. All of these things are barriers to exercise and physical activity that are disproportionately experienced by poor people. We talked about how regular eating is one of the best ways to maintain a healthy weight and lifestyle. That's really hard if your job is irregular, if you have a lot of different jobs, if you work different shifts, or if you have these same like family caregiving responsibilities that just make it hard to eat on a regular schedule. Access to medical care in the United States depends on income, and poor people lack access to adequate medical care. Going to the doctor regularly can help catch weight gain before it gets to the point of overweight and obesity. It can help manage pain and chronic conditions. Speaking regularly to a doctor can help improve someone's nutrition knowledge, their commitment and confidence in preparing healthy foods. It can help them make different choices about healthy eating and sedentary behavior, but lacking access to medical care cuts people off from all of these benefits. Poverty is associated with higher education, and people with more education have more ability to do things like read nutrition labels, cook healthy meals, do all of that really complicated, effortful budgeting that the government thinks all food stamp recipients should just be able to do. And all of this also kind of neglects the role of just environment and social class and who you know. There's a lot of scientific evidence that if your peer group is more overweight or more obese, you yourself are more likely to gain weight. Whereas being in a peer group that emphasizes health and that has time and knowledge and ability and energy to engage in a healthier lifestyle creates positive peer pressure, support, and modeling that allows you to do that too. So these pictures also show the impact of the kind of job you have and the place where you work. This is the Google cafeteria, where employees at Google have access to free, fresh, healthy food as a perk of their job. Of course, to even have that job, you have to have a college degree. So these are already higher SES, higher income, higher educated people. But by virtue of having all those privileges and benefits already, they also have a job that provides them access to healthy food. Whereas if you are, for example, a trucker or work in a convenience store, this is kind of the food that you're working with. This is the food that's accessible to you while you're at work. Makes it a lot harder to maintain a healthy lifestyle and prevent weight gain. Getting back to food insecurity, restricting your intake for any reason creates the conditions that lead to the binge, purge, restrict cycle. Restricting food because you're food insecure and you have children in the house. As the adult, you're usually the one who undereats or skips a meal so that the kids can eat. That leads to restriction, food cravings, preoccupation, pressure to break your diet, guilt and shame about breaking your diet, not because of weight loss motivations, but because the reason you're not eating is so that your kids can eat. All of this leads to this unhealthy cycle of restricting, being preoccupied with food, being guilty about eating, increased efforts to restrict. Even in households without kids, by definition, food insecurity means not having enough. So the response to food insecurity is to try to make the food you have last longer, to restrict, to plan ahead, to really try to control your eating in a way that we know is really unhealthy and can lead to disordered eating. So in summary, poverty creates an obesogenic food environment. Poor people in the United States are more likely to be overweight or to gain weight simply because of the lifestyle that they have in the places where they live, in addition to their access to healthy food. Weight gain, weight stigma, trying to achieve this unobtainable thin ideal, all of this leads to increased efforts at dieting, which, as we know, can put people in this binge, purge, restrict cycle and contribute to disordered eating. Even when people aren't dieting and aren't trying to lose weight, when people are food insecure, or when they're restricting eating for other reasons, like just not having enough time, that can also trigger the cycle of being preoccupied with food, giving into cravings, trying to cut back. And then on top of all of this, once disordered eating is already established, stress, just like it can trigger and worsen all psychopathology, triggers and worsens disordered eating. So eating disorders are a class issue, in summary. But in a broader summary, eating disorders are defined as problematic behaviors around eating and food. Weight and eating behavior are very tightly regulated by our physiology. With ARFID, we talked about how food-seeking behaviors and food variety are regulated by reinforcement and associative learning, prepared conditioning. Here, we're talking about how our bodies are basically programmed to prevent us from losing weight. We evolved in an environment where the biggest threat to our survival was starvation, not diseases of obesity. The physiological and cognitive consequences of attempting to lose weight can lead to disordered eating behavior by putting someone into the binge, purge, restrict cycle. Taking a step back, the diagnosis of anorexia nervosa hasn't always been about weight. It's been about any effort to limit food intake in pursuit of any goal. So we might broaden the definition of weight and shape eating disorders by instead thinking about goal-oriented eating disorders, like the goal of eating healthy in orthorexia, or the goal of having an extremely muscular physique in bigorexia. People who don't have this sort of temperamental ability to pursue a really extreme goal, to really succeed and achieve it, whatever they set their minds to, through extreme self-abnegation, extreme rigidity, going for their goal at all costs. People who don't have that temperament are prone to developing binge eating and compensatory behavior without significant weight loss, leading to subclinical disordered eating, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. People who have the ability to set aside everything in pursuit of a goal, even through unhealthy behavior, are at risk for anorexia nervosa and atypical anorexia. In the modern United States, societal contributors to disordered eating include weight stigma, an unobtainable thin ideal body type, an obesogenic food environment that we all live in, and lifestyle that we all have, sedentary, lots of access to highly palatable foods, and increasing rates of poverty and food insecurity that create an even more obesogenic food environment for a subset of the population based on their income. Okay, that was a lot. Thanks for listening.